If the New Orleans Saints want to continue to push the envelope on offense, tight end, and wide receiver are two positions they could continue to add to. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we've taken a look at the roster, right? The 53-man roster projection on Monday. On Tuesday, we broke down a quick look at what the starters look like and why the New Orleans Saints offense looks to be in good hands when it comes to their starting skill position players. But today, we're taking a look at where the New Orleans Saints could potentially improve and where they can find their reinforcement. So we'll wrap up the show with a look at some premier practice squad candidates that the New Orleans Saints should keep around. Before that, we'll take a look at the offensive line and why the New Orleans Saints should continue to invest in competition along that unit. But to kick us off, we're going to take a look at wide receiver and tight end as two places where the New Orleans Saints could still get more competitive and maybe even add more talent. We appreciate you very much. As always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day, every day, and for being an everydayer here on the Locked On Saints podcast, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first ticket purchase. Terms apply. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed with Game Time. So for me, I think if the New Orleans Saints want to, they could continue to invest in more talent at both wide receiver and at tight end. And I know that there are arguments against doing that. I'm not saying that the New Orleans Saints must do it or that they would be better off doing it or whatever. But I think that there's like two different ways of looking at it, right? There's the how do you impact the top of your position group? And I don't know if the New Orleans Saints necessarily need that. This is Chris Olave's first season right away, fully the number one guy in the offense. I think it makes sense to just sort of let him have that, and not even let him have that. He's earned it. But I don't think that necessarily bringing in somebody that's going to compete for what you would call like the dominator snaps, which would be, percentage share of targets, percentage share of yardage, percentage share of the offense, basically. Instead of doing that, what you could do, it would have to be a dramatic move, like trading for Brandon Ayuk, who is going into his conversations with the San Francisco 49ers, said that he is willing to play for another team if they can't reach the extension that he's looking for. He's taken negotiations personally, but his number one option is to stay in San Francisco. They'll probably get something worked out. But hey, if the Saints get an opportunity to pounce there, pounce, right? Or if any of the other 31 teams get an opportunity to pounce there, you pounce. So you could try to impact the top of your position group like that. The other way to build up that room is to continue to raise its floor. Now, the Saints have a lot of talent there. Even at the quote-unquote bottom of the Saints wide receiver list, you look at guys like, well, we have to put Stanley Morgan Jr. down at the bottom for right now because we haven't seen him yet, right? He's been rehabbing and kind of doing like work off to the side and everything. So he's not necessarily at the bottom. He's just kind of like off to the side, I would say. But then you look at undrafted free agents like Mason Tipton and Jermaine Jackson, formerly Kyle Sheets, who they have since moved on from. But those guys are explosive. They bring you some special teams acumen. They bring you some potential wide receiver depth, and they bring you some really good practice squad options. We'll dive into more practice squad options later on in the episode, but I wanted to give a quick mention of kind of just where like what we would see as the bottom of the Saints wide receiver room at the moment. Then you look at guys like Equinemius St. Brown, Bub Means coming in as a first-year rookie, Cedric Wilson having joined. That's kind of the middle of your wide receiver room. And then the top of your wide receiver room is Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed, and an A.T. Perry maybe bridges the gap between tier 1 and tier 2. So what you can do is instead of worrying about impacting your tier 1, you can raise the talent and generate more competition in tiers 3 and 4. And so there are ways for the Saints to do that. Let's look at what they have. In tier 1, we mentioned guys like Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed. You can consider them field stretchers, deep threats, all those other things. They both have shown throughout OTAs and minicamp, that they are developing further as 3-level threats. Chris Olave has kind of always been the 3-level threat, just hasn't always been utilized that way. And this is why him coming into his first year as the number 1 wide receiver makes sense, or is so important for him. But you have those guys. You have the big slot option, but you don't have like the small kind of dirty work slot option, right? The quick short area quickness guy. So that's where guys in this year's free agency that are still available, like Hunter Renfrow, still make some sense. I don't think I'm pounding the table as much as I used to be for Hunter Renfrow at this point. But if the Saints wanted to add something unique to their offense, Hunter Renfrow checks that box. There are other guys out there too. You know, if you're looking for maybe a better yards after catch threat or an additional yards after catch threat, guys like Jakeem Grant, who was supposed to come in and try out with the Saints. I believe it was during rookie minicamp, if I recall correctly, but then wasn't there. Jamal Agnew is another one that has some of that get the ball in his hands in space. He becomes a returner experience and style as well. But then you also might have guys like that in, well, first of all, Rashid Shaheed, of course, is one of those guys, but got to see where Mason Tipton is, got to see where Jermaine Jackson is. But you have the big-bodied guys, A.T. Perry, Cedric Wilson, Equinemius St. Brown. Bub Means plays big, plays with the good attacking the middle of the field mentality, all those things. So it's really about what are you specifically trying to add and where specifically you're trying to impact. So if you can find guys that can build up the quote-unquote bottom of your wide receiver room, it might be worth the investment just about driving that competition. And then maybe it's not that those players stick around, it's that they make the players that you do intend on sticking around better, compete, all those other things. You could do something similar with the tight end room. Now, it becomes really complicated here depending upon what happens with Juwan Johnson. I have a feeling that if Juwan Johnson's not ready to go at the beginning of the season, you're going to see a third different tight end end up making the roster behind, not ahead of, or in place of Juwan Johnson. And it won't be ahead of Foster Moreau and a guy like Dallin Holker, who I can't not predict to be on the roster at this point, right, as of June 26th. But instead, adding to the bottom of that room, right? You let Foster Moreau take more snaps. You let Dallin Holker take more snaps. You let Taysom Hill take more tight end snaps. All that if Juwan Johnson's not ready to go. I don't think you're going to be looking to replace Juwan. I think you're just sliding the other guys up. It's that Pez dispenser analogy we used, a few weeks ago when we were talking about the top 51 salary cap situation and all that stuff. And so instead, you're looking at adding somebody to the bottom. So you could find maybe that's where a guy like Jimmy Graham makes sense. Maybe you go after a more athletic, slightly younger guy like a Bryson Hopkins, or you go for a bigger body like Tyler Croft, or you go for somebody that's already in your room like a Michael Jacobson, another bigger bodied guy, 6'6", 6'7". If he can play above the rim, maybe he's your red zone threat. We'll see. So I think that the Saints do have ways to continue to bolster the talent of both rooms, wide receiver and tight end, without kind of, when I use the word upsetting, I don't mean feelings wise. I just mean like interrupting or disrupting what the top of their depth chart looks like, and still make it very clear, like, hey, you are the guys at the top of the depth, at the top of this depth chart, and build it up that way, build it up from the bottom as opposed to trying to impact up at the top. But hey, if you wanted to impact the top, the one big move could potentially be available, but feels unlikely, and that would of course be that Brandon Ayuk move and situation. Coming up next, let's take a look at the New Orleans Saints offensive line, because that is where I think the Saints really should be still trying to generate more and more competition over the course of training camp. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by friends at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, patience, all of that formula that makes winning championships possible. It's also what keeps your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors is everything that you need to be able to level your ride or die up to peak performance. Whether you're looking for superchargers, roof racks, LED headlights, exhaust kits, whatever you need and more, they've got for you over at ebaymotors.com. They've got you covered. With over 122 parts and accessories for your number one ride or die, you're always going to find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's guaranteed fit, that part is guaranteed to fit the first time, every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts that you need at the prices that you want, make sure that you level up your MVP, bring it up to that peak performance, and start stacking up those huge wins this summer with ebaymotors.com. Keep your ride or die alive today by visiting ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply, and eBay Guarantee Fit available only to U.S. customers. All right. right, family. If the New Orleans Saints want to make sure that their offensive line is truly improved in 2024, bringing in more competition all along the room could end up helping them ensure that that will be the case. We appreciate you very much, as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day, every day. Don't forget to go and check out Locked On Sports Today, YouTube's first ever national sports 24/7 stream program, specifically to bring you the biggest stories from around the world of sports every day, brought to you by the teams that cover them the most and the closest. Make sure you go and check them out over on the Locked On Sports Today YouTube page, as well as on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, as we take a look at where the New Orleans Saints could potentially continue to build up their room a bit, or build up their roster a bit, I think the offensive line room is a place where you can continue to generate competition. Let's discuss three different things, right? Why generating competition, how, or rather the players that could come in to generate the competition, and then what the impact of that competition, could have. So you could look at this as one of two ways, just like we talked about wide receiver, right? Do you impact the top of the room or do you impact the bottom of the room? I think there's arguments for all cases in this one. I do like that the New Orleans Saints, who in the past have relied on youth as their depth, guys like Landon Young, guys like Will Clapp, guys like Cameron Tom back in the day, who was a free agent again, by the way. They've typically relied on youth when it comes to their depth, not necessarily their sixth guy, right? That guy moves around, and that was typically over the course of the past few years, a combination of like Andrus Peat, James Hurst, and, you know, guys like Josh Andrews and Cameron Irving, things like that, and Landon Young. But I think that the thing that I'm looking at that's so different here is that the Saints have brought in a lot of veteran experience to back up their starters. Now the youth are the starters, right? Trevor Penning in his third year. You've got Taliese Fuanga in his rookie year. You've got Nick Saldiveri at left guard in his second year. And so I think that the why behind generating competition here is to push the development of those young players. I think that's a big one. Pushing the development of guys like Trevor Penning, pushing the preparedness, development, and readiness of a Taliese Fuanga, pushing the development of a Nick Saldiveri, pushing the development of some of the depth behind them as well, or at least challenging some of the veteran depth that's behind them as well. It also pushes the development of guys like Landon Young and Mark Evans, who are, you know, closer to the depth conversation than the starter conversation. And so I think you can find that competition in free agency still right now. So let's say you wanted to find a starter. So now let's get to the how, right? The why is you need your offensive line to work. You want them to develop. Competition can help to push that development. The how and who comes down to a couple of different options. Let's say you wanted to challenge the top of your roster at either tackle spot, or you're not so sure that Trevor Penning is going to pan out at right tackle after all. You want to move Taliese Fuanga back over to right tackle, but you don't feel comfortable starting Trevor Penning at left tackle. David Bakhtiari could be an option to bring in to compete during training camp and then maybe start the season there. And look, here's the thing with the David Bakhtiari. You don't know if he's going to make it through the season, right? He's had so many, you know, his injury history has continued to pile on. It led to him and the Green Bay Packers parting ways. He's 32 and 3/4 years old. He'll be 33 during this season. So not the long-term solution, but if you wanted to generate and drive competition right now and even give these tackles another veteran guy to learn from at the position, which they don't necessarily have right now. Ryan Ramczyk is busy dealing with his stuff. There's no Teron Armstead in the building anymore. There's just simply not that player that is that veteran presence at tackle right now. You've got guys like Taliese Fuanga. You've got guys like Trevor Penning. You've got young guys like Landon Young. So if you wanted to go out and find, and then Josiah Zirum is in that conversation too. So if you want to go and find those guys, I think you can find those guys in free agency right now. Guys like David Bakhtiari, DJ Humphries, Charles Leno. Again, none of them are going to be 17-game starters for you, more than likely. But if you wanted to bring in somebody to help for the development as a veteran presence and maybe get a starter early on in the season out of it, you would get those. And we've seen the New Orleans Saints take these swings before. They did it just last year with Trey Turner, who unfortunately things didn't work out with. But if we wanted to bounce back into the interior and the depth conversation, which I think in a year this is probably the first time in a while to where I've looked at this team and said, I feel better about their depth, but I have big questions about the starting offensive line. Whereas in the past, it's been okay. Well, as long as the starting offensive line stays healthy, they're good. And there's still some truth to that because going to depth means you are still going to a replacement level player. But if you wanted to push that, maybe bringing a guy like Trey Turner back makes sense. Maybe reuniting with a guy like Cameron Irving, who was such like a culture fit, just a joy to be around in the locker room and all those other things. Got that start against the Jacksonville Jaguars at right tackle. Maybe there's another guy that comes in and can help to compete and push that competition, push that development over at the tackle position at the lower end of the roster, competing with the Landon Youngs, competing with the Josiah Zirums, competing with those tackles that are playing out there, then I think that that's got some value. Ali Udo eventually steps into a role like that too. So I think that like building that competition is a really, really important part of building the development of this offensive line. So how does that all translate then if you do that? Well, if you push the development, you push the competition along that line, it gets this offensive line a little bit more prepared, right? Moves them into being ready for facing the competition that lines up across from them, pushes their study of the new playbook, understanding what their new roles are, all those other things. If I'm making a decision right now of building out an offensive line, I want the athletic guys, right? I'm okay giving up some of the experience to get the athleticism, because athleticism is what's going to win in this offensive system, right? The wide zone system that's going to want you to snap and move and get off the ball, get off the line, hit that read step, climb up to the second level, climb up to the third level, all that. That's going to be a big part of what it is that makes the run game in New Orleans for Clint Kubiak and the New Orleans Saints. That's what's going to make it work. Now, the tricky part, and maybe the place where you want to see the most growth and why maybe some of these veteran additions, another place where these veteran additions can help, is simply developing as pass protectors. Because if it's, and Brian Baldinger talked to us about this the second night of the draft, if it's 3rd and 9, there's no play action call for that. There's no taking the pressure off the offensive line. The offensive line has to beat the defensive line ahead of them. They have to not let the defensive line get to the quarterback. And so many times last year did we see the vast majority of sacks on Derek Carr took place on 3rd downs, going into late in the game, things like that. Now, some of that is trying to hold on to the ball and trying to make plays because you're in those situations where you have to make plays. So scoring points earlier alleviates a lot of those concerns later in the game too, which was a place where the Saints struggled last year. But even still, you have to be able to, as an offensive line, be better than the guy in front of you in those game situations where you don't have the help of play action and maybe the eye candy isn't as effective in things like that. So that's why I think that driving a little bit more competition, pushing the competition on offensive line could make sense for the New Orleans Saints, even if it means not landing new starters, but just helps to build up those starters a little bit. I think that there's value in that. And of course, you lean on athleticism over experience in these situations as well. But bringing in some experience to compete makes sense. All right, coming up next, let's take a look at the New Orleans Saints practice squad. Because look, you don't have to make an active roster anymore to be an impact player. Let's look at some of the guys that could have an impact from the practice squad in 2024. We got that coming up for you as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. If the New Orleans Saints want to make sure that they are remaining competitive throughout the season, building up a pretty impressive practice squad can help to get them there for a variety of reasons. We'll break down the reasons and the players that we think should end up on the practice squad, or at least should be targets for the practice squad, here to wrap up today's episode. We appreciate you very much for being here. Don't forget, we are your team every day. So coming up tomorrow, we're going to take a look at why the New Orleans Saints offensive coaching staff changes are one of the 3 best things that they did this offseason. We'll break down all 3 in tomorrow's episode. Let me know what you think the 3 best things the New Orleans Saints did. Don't limit yourself to just player moves, right? Coaching, everything else, taking training camp over to the West Coast, like whatever those things might be. Let me know. Let me know what you think your top 3 like offensive moves were for the New Orleans Saints. All right, so what I want to look at here are some of the players on the practice squad are some of the players on the Saints 90-man roster right now that would be fantastic fits for their practice squad. Let's start over on the offensive side because I want to start at quarterback here. There is a case to be made. We did our 53-man roster breakdown on Monday, and in that 53-man roster, I had Derek Carr, Jake Haener, and Spencer Rattler, all three of those quarterbacks still making the roster. That leaves Nathan Peterman as the odd man out. So there is a chance to keep Nathan Peterman on the practice squad, but I don't know that you need to. Because not only do you have, in that scenario of all three being on the roster, not only do you have Derek Carr, Jake Haener, and Spencer Rattler, you've also got Taysom Hill. So I would feel pretty good about having depth at the quarterback position. Now, the Saints don't necessarily have to carry three quarterbacks on their roster, but there's nothing wrong with them doing it either because they can still appoint the third quarterback on their active roster as an inactive emergency third quarterback for game day. So one way or another, it's fun. But if Jake Haener or Spencer Rattler, which I just cannot see at this moment, but just for the sake of the conversation, if one of them somehow does not make the roster, then yeah, I think they become a priority trying to get them back to the practice squad, but don't expect them to live on your practice squad for very long. I don't think that they're going to sit there for very long. So let's look at some of the other positions where you could find some impact players. I want to start at running back because I think this guy is has the opportunity to maybe be one of the most impactful. Because look, it's just unlikely that Alvin Kamara, Jamal Williams, and Kendre Miller are each going to give you all 17 games of the season. It's very unlikely that's going to happen at the running back position where you're taking so many hits, you're having a cut on the dime, you're having to change direction. There's just so many of those things that are going to happen. It's very unlikely that all three of them give you 17 games. If they do, super cool. And by the way, probably a pretty good offense in that case. However, unlikely. So I look at guys like Jordan Mims, the second-year undrafted running back out of Fresno State, was originally signed by the Buffalo Bills, waived, brought here to New Orleans last year, stuck around in New Orleans all year, and has looked awesome in training camp. I'm not trying to say that he's looked like a superstar in training camp or anything like that, but in terms of running in this system, the wide zone system, and being able to have the vision to know, do I bend, bang, or bounce? Like, how do I, which hole do I attack? How do I incorporate myself in the passing game? All those other things. He's done a really good job of all of that so far. So great, right? Being where you need to be and being where you're expected to be when to be there, I think is very important. He's done a very good job of those things. I'm not trying to say he's a superstar or anything like that, but he's done a good job of checking the boxes of the things that make you of value to a football team. James Robinson, the same thing. James Robinson is also, I think we forget sometimes, was a 1,000-yard rusher in the NFL. And a lot of that had to do with being complemented with the scheme that he was running in, which was a pretty nice run game over in Jacksonville at that time. The places that he has ended up since then, it hasn't worked out for him, but this offense feels a lot more familiar to him, he has told me. And so I think that there's a good shot that he becomes another one of those guys that you absolutely want to keep around. I don't want to leave out Jacob Kibodi from this conversation, from UL, all these other things. I just think that, especially with his ability as a receiver out of the backfield, but we just haven't seen as much yet. So just want to see it during training camp. But I think any of those three running backs are guys to keep around. We mentioned we were discussing wide receivers earlier, Mason Tipton, Jermaine Jackson. Both of them give you return value. They give you additional special teams value, and they give you a little bit of an explosive value in terms of what their play style is as a wide receiver. It doesn't mean that they're going to be explosive at this level, but that was their brand in terms of their play in college. So each one of those guys could be good options for you to keep around in the practice squad as well. Because again, are you going to get all 17 games from all 6 wide receivers on the roster? It's not likely. So having those guys that can move up either for special teams purposes or for wide receiver depth gives you some good stuff there. And then finally on the offensive side, I'll look at tight end here. And look, there's a bunch of offensive linemen that could fit here too, but it's just a long list, right? And keep as many offensive linemen as you can on your practice squad. It's there that's for obvious reasons. Same thing for your defensive line. You're always going to need pass protectors. You're always going to need pass rushers. You're always going to need run protectors. You're always going to need run stoppers. So yes, offensive line, check every box. But tight end Michael Jacobson is a really interesting one because, again, you don't know if you're going to have Juwan Johnson early in the season. If you do have Juwan Johnson early in the season, how much is he able to go, right? He might be active, but is he on a pitch count? If he is on a pitch count, maybe you elevate a Michael Jacobson to kind of help you cut into some of those snaps, along with Foster Morrow, along with Dallin Holker, who I expect to make the roster, and along with Taysom Hill, because you're going to see a lot of 2 tight end sets. So having 4 tight ends that you can rotate through makes some sense there. So having that additional guy on the practice squad makes a lot of sense. And I think Jacobson can give you one of those contested catch, big body, red zone target types that I know the New Orleans Saints would love to be able to revitalize that role after finding success with it with Jimmy Graham last year, although they could find that success with Jimmy Graham himself if they wanted to. All right, let's take a look at defense now. I'm going to go straight to the secondary here. Millard Bradford, Roderick Teamer, both really, really good options to keep around on your practice squad for entirely different reasons. Millard Bradford, for me, is just a good development piece that you just want to continue to invest in. Remarkably talented ball hawk type guy, playmaker type guy, good ball skills, good all around, deep safety kind of guy. Hard to come by, hard to find. And so when you can get that guy with a coach like Marcus Robertson, who primarily works with the safeties, to build up what it is that he can do, who he can be at the next level, I think you just lean in on that development. So keeping Millard Bradford around is less about the impact that he might be able to have in 2024, but more about the impact player he could potentially grow into. Roderick Teamer, on the other hand, as a veteran safety, gives you that veteran depth and then also gives you a fantastic special teamer as well. I wouldn't be surprised if him and JT Gray are potentially competing for the same roster spot. There's a real chance something like that happens. JT Gray's been dealing with injuries and things like that. Roderick Teamer, very good special teamer, no pun intended. Could those two be battling out for one spot? We'll see. But if not, or if Teamer doesn't get that spot, because I think ultimately JT Gray earns, deserves, and holds on to that spot, but we'll see. But if that happens, then I think Teamer is your practice squad safety that can help you out on special teams. Similarly, linebacker Monty Rice. I had a hard time not putting Monty Rice on my final 53. It's just that the Saints keep so many drafted rookies that I had to keep Jalen Ford on there just based on their typical trajectories or their typical process. But for me, a guy like Monty Rice belongs on your practice squad, along with Anthony Orji as well, who both give you these developmental linebackers that could potentially come in a pinch, but also serve as special teams guys. And then Ugo Amadi is the last one that I'll end with, because I didn't have him on my active roster. I also had the Saints keeping 6 linebackers, which might not be necessary. They might only keep 5 linebackers and then add an additional defensive back. That's where I think Ugo Amadi comes in. But he plays punt protector. He plays coverage. He plays like coverage on special teams coverage. He plays kick and punt return stuff. He is a potential returner for you. He is a potential slot corner for you. He's a potential safety for you. He's a core special teamer for you. He just does so much. And so I could absolutely see Ugo Amadi, if he doesn't end up on the active roster, end up as a premier practice squad guy that's almost immediately active. The other way that the Saints could go, and John Hendricks and I talked about this not too long ago, is that the Saints could technically, instead of keeping a fullback on their active roster, do like they did last year, to where they actually save that roster spot for an additional spot to get a look at 53 players, but then have their fullback on their practice squad and then use all of the game day elevations for that fullback, because they're going to use a fullback. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that fullback has to come from their active roster. Could come from the practice squad. So guys like Xander Horvath as well as Adam Prentice could end up in that situation, just like Adam Prentice was last year. And then they eventually moved him to the active roster once they used all the elevations. So they could use some of those some of those practice squad spots to hold on to a guy that's effectively a game day guy for the first 3 weeks or so. So not a bad way to go and then buy yourself additional defensive linemen, additional offensive linemen, additional secondary player, additional wide receiver if you wanted, all that. So that's where I think the Saints could potentially go with their practice squad. All right, y'all. Appreciate you very much for being here, for joining us for another episode of Locked On Saints. Next time I see you, we'll be on vacation together. So come through. I got a seat for everybody. No, I'm just kidding. I don't show up at the airport. I can't help you. But I will be seeing you from afar, and it will be a lot of fun. So I appreciate you very much. As always, make a Locked On Saints your first listen of the day, every day for your second listen. Jake Madison, Locked On Pelicans, has been balling over at Locked On Pels. Make sure you go and check that out. And Matt Moscona's great return over at Locked On LSU has been monumental. So go and check it out over at Locked On LSU as well. We appreciate you very much. As always, making Locked On Saints a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you. coffee mug dope.